All right, everyone, it's now been reported that there is kind of a literal Russian doomsday weapon. Now, there are several variants of this sort of age-old tale, sort of this Strangelove stuff. The main claim that's made, when we're talking about a major nuclear power having specifically a doomsday weapon or weapons, we're talking about a dead hand system. That is an automatically triggered system. For instance, you have a network of sensors that sends high radiation and seismic events across your country. You've got a system that interprets that as, hey, we've just gotten nuked, and automatically launches the system. The Russians verifiably, according to their own sort of declassified material, had something akin to this. At least did in the 60s and 70s, albeit it wasn't fully automated. Basically, you had a few deep bunkers in remote areas where someone would be notified, and then they could determine for themselves whether it was an error or whether it was actually time to press the little red button. A few highly trained individuals. So it's not really a true doomsday device, of course. It is feasible, it's possible if you knew where those bunkers were, you could knock off those people and prevent a retaliatory strike. My idea that I've always spoken of is that the doomsday device is the inevitable creation of nuclear power. That is, you've got sites around the United States, Russia, and elsewhere in the world. Even in nations that don't have nuclear weapons programs, you have nuclear plants creating power, in many cases. It's all over Europe. It's present in Latin America and other places as well. If any of these plants stops being maintained because order has broken down, it will eventually, including the newer dry storage type, it will eventually become compromised. And, you'll have a Fukushima event I've spoken of, for instance. These new designs that are used can store nuclear fuel effectively for a very long time. But if the actual outside of the building, if its integrity becomes compromised and humidity and water are allowed in, animals potentially get in, looters potentially get in, it becomes a problem because you've no longer got anyone who's well-trained enough to move the material without dying. Basically, you can't do anything about it, especially when you've probably lost most of your literate scientific population because they were in the urban areas servicing those systems to begin with. They've been largely vaporized or died of leukemia. You would end up with a world that would have far more radiation in it than the nuclear war itself would release. The amount would be greater. It would be greater than the amount released by all the nuclear weapons that would be fired. It would affect countries. It would go beyond the northern hemisphere. Most nuclear scenarios involving U.S. and Russia, maybe China, the NATO countries, they allow the southern hemisphere to escape. I spoke of this before, and actually there's a report from the 80s saying like the new powers of the world basically will be nations like Argentina, South Africa, New Zealand, Chile. By the way, you could do worse. Some of those countries have better sanity than maybe Western Europe or Russia. Yeah. So that's what I've spoken of, is nuclear power is the problem. And it would even harm the southern hemisphere. They'd be the only ones who would be food solvent, maybe. They'd still be suffering from catastrophic after effects for decades to come. Now they're talking about something called Status 6. And this may be a ploy, a bit of propaganda, or it may be a real thing. It appears to be a kind of a Russian subclass equipped with an extremely large and extremely powerful multi-megaton, or tens of megatons, type of weapon. At least that's what it appears on paper. Some speculation is that the Russians basically showed a picture of this on state media as propaganda, that they don't even have such a thing. It's a warning, or it's just an attempt to intimidate. Others think it's sort of U.S. propaganda to take an image that they, otherwise would know as false, maybe, and use it as a justification to modernize our own nuclear arsenal. Regardless, it is possible to create such a situation. You have a deep sub idling somewhere out in the middle of the ocean that fires an extremely large torpedo at a depth that can't be intercepted readily, and then it hits a coastal region like New York City, Boston, Los Angeles, and just wipes it off the face of the earth. As for the actual size of the weapon at that point, would it really matter, for example, if you were to hit New York City with a 20-30 megaton weapon right on the tip of Manhattan? You kill half the population through vaporizing them alone. The city's fucked. But if you were to release just a 2 or 3 megaton weapon, wouldn't it basically have the same effect? The loss of life, the amount of damage, the after effects of the radiation, and the panic that it would cause would probably destroy the city anyway. The panic would ultimately be the biggest determinant of whether the city was still a thing thereafter, because otherwise most of its population would have killed itself or others off or fled. In the wake of a nuclear attack, with a population that, since the 1990s now is unprepared for nuclear Armageddon, you would lose millions or tens of millions of lives that otherwise might be spared just through the immediate chaotic aftermath of people running their cars off the road, shooting at each other, thinking it's Armageddon and going on a spree, killing themselves in panic or in sadness, and things of that nature. Disagreements leading to fights and then killing potentially or injuries over what should be done, within families or friend circles, breakdown of communication, breakdown of the health infrastructure. You would lose probably as many people through panic and through disease resulting from that panic as you would the initial strikes. That's why I've argued for the restoration of civil defense in this country. I think it should be split back off of FEMA, which is under DHS. They should have nothing to do with it. It should go back to being largely a civilian system. It should not be bureaucratic or centralized. It should be openly condoned and encouraged. It should go right along with the Second Amendment, and it should be a policy that the so-called conservatives need to take up in this country. We could spare tens of millions of lives in the possibility of a nuclear attack. Nobody wants it to happen, but if it does, wouldn't it be lovely to be prepared enough so that you still have a population, you still have the rudiments of order? You've got people that are trained, that are skilled, that know what to do to help others, and to restore things afterwards. You restore the basic function of sanitation and electricity alone. Imagine how much better that is than basically slipping back into the Stone Age for what decades maybe to come, as basically you would end up with mob rule. You would end up with a patchwork U.S. where mobs and organized gangs and groups of people would, in a tribal way, would try to govern their own regions. You wouldn't have any real federal system anymore. You'd have some troops. There'd probably be multiple factions that would war with each other over what form the new country would need to take. This is something that I think we need to create plans for. But as for this nuclear torpedo, when they claim that it's probably blown up in size, basically they're puffing up their own weapon system to scare the West. Yeah, they probably are. But it should still give you pause, because it's not really going to matter. If you were to hit the tip of Manhattan with a 2 or 3 megaton device, wipe out the entire lower half of Manhattan and the coastal parts of Brooklyn and Queens and certainly half of Staten Island. If you were to do that, anyone left alive outside of that area, whether they get irradiated by the heavier fallout particles or not, is probably going to lose their shit. They're not going to have electricity. There's going to be no running water. People will be looting and shooting. They probably won't even be able to get out into the street to get out of New York City because it would be a minefield of dead corpses. And people, taking up position and taking up arms to try to defend what they feel is. You might end up with weird situations like a New Age gang of New York, where people have taken over a skyscraper and they're at war with the next skyscraper over. You can have such a weird situation, block by block fighting, taking potentially hundreds of thousands of lives that otherwise could have been spared. But keep one thing in mind. Without a 100% system of deterrence, and in the absence of an anti-missile, sort of an anti-weapon in general system that works basically all the time, if you're in a major urban zone, you're a sitting duck in the case of a nuclear war. You're probably going to die. I hate to tell you out there, but statistically speaking, more than half of you would die in a nuclear war. Your odds are not good. Your odds are pretty damn good if you're in the middle of nowhere and you're not downwind from a major nuclear plant or near a major base. Otherwise, you probably get fried. Here, it would probably be survivable. I don't think anyone would waste a nuke on Rutland, but Burlington, hell, I'd get hit. Someone would fire on Burlington. It's got over 100,000 people you could vaporize, and it would destabilize the entire state. Of course you'd want to hit Burlington, and Montpelier probably too. So Concord might survive, but Manchester gets hit. Old Orchard Beach survives, but Portland, Maine gets hit. Boston is completely gone. It would literally look like the Fallout Commonwealth. And that's really, the Doomsday device is essentially any system inherent in which survivability severely drops off that would otherwise be present because of bad decisions or infrastructure. We've already made those. It's called nuclear power. You don't need to launch 30 megaton torpedoes at large urban areas if you've got nuclear plants nearby. It's not necessary. The entire population will get irradiated so heavily, 90% of them will be goners within a year. They'll get leukemia. They'll die very painfully, and there won't be a medical apparatus to save them. That alone will cause so much additional panic down the road, so much more instability. It's not clear that the United States would survive as a nation. It's almost impossible for Russia to survive too, but I mean, that's definitely not the sort of victory that you want. Well, the enemy's gone. We're basically gone too, but there's like 2 of us left. We're ghouls, but we're still here. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a U.S. that you could... it's not exactly making America great again, let's put it that way. That's about all. Peace out.